Our choices shape us, and they also destroy us. William Shakespeare. This phrase perfectly captures what addiction does to a person's life. There are moments when the weight of life feels overwhelming, and in search of relief, we find an escape. It may start small, a glass of wine to relax, endless scrolling on social media, or perhaps a pill to calm your nerves. At first, it seems to help. For a brief moment, the world feels lighter. But what begins as relief soon becomes a prison. The cycle takes hold. You know it's destroying you, yet it feels like the only thing keeping you afloat. If you've never experienced this, imagine the despair. Imagine being controlled by something that consumes you, but also feels like the only escape from pain. It's not weakness. It's not a lack of willpower. It's a battle with something invisible, something deeply rooted within you. And yet, the question never goes away. Why can't I stop? Why does this feel bigger than me? For many, addiction is not just a behavior. It reflects something much deeper, a desperate attempt to fill a void, to soothe a pain that words cannot describe. Today, we will view addiction differently, exploring the insights of two great thinkers, Carl Jung and Gabor Maté. We'll delve into what lies behind this vicious cycle, why it grips so tightly, and how it can be broken. This is not a simple issue, and what's at stake here goes beyond intellectual understanding. It's about grasping and feeling what it means to live with the weight of addiction. After all, is addiction merely a choice? Or does it reveal something much deeper about the human psyche? Imagine trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. It's absurd, almost laughable, but profoundly tragic. This metaphor perfectly describes addiction, a desperate attempt to soothe inner pain that ultimately intensifies it. Carl Jung saw addiction as an escape, not from the external world, but from oneself, from the hidden parts of the psyche that we avoid confronting. For him, when we deny parts of who we are, we create an internal void. This void, in turn, triggers an unrelenting desire to fill it with something, anything. Gabor Maté, author of In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, complements this perspective by stating that addiction is rarely about pleasure. Instead, it is an attempt to escape a pain that words cannot describe. Not physical pain, but emotional wounds that remain open, even if unseen. This void can stem from many sources: unresolved trauma, a childhood marked by emotional disconnection, or even the feeling of being adrift in a world that seems devoid of meaning. It's like a silent, invisible black hole that consumes everything around it. At first, the escape mechanism appears to work. A glass of wine to relax, hours scrolling through social media, or that shopping spree that brings momentary relief. But what begins as a temporary fix quickly becomes a trap. The paradox is that the more we try to fill the void, the more it grows, becoming insatiable. For Jung, addiction was not a matter of moral weakness or lack of willpower. It was a psychic imbalance, a reflection of unresolved internal conflicts. He believed that addiction was, unconsciously, a search for something greater, perhaps meaning or a lost connection. Maté deepens this idea, asserting that unless we address the pain fueling the addiction, we're merely masking the problem. It's like placing a bandage over an infected wound. It may look resolved on the surface, but the infection continues to fester. What fuels addiction isn't the behavior itself, but the attempt to escape something deeper. And this raises the question, what is truly behind it? What pain are we trying to silence? Perhaps the key to understanding addiction lies not in focusing on what is consumed, but on the emptiness it seeks to fill. To explore this, we must go beyond the surface and delve into the layers of trauma, disconnection, and emotional pain that shape our vulnerabilities. Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. Imagine carrying a silence within you, not a peaceful silence, but a consuming void. It doesn't scream, but its presence is constant, like a hole that never closes. Carl Jung believed this void is not merely an absence, but a reflection of something lost, a disconnection from essential parts of ourselves, often buried in childhood. Childhood, for Jung, is where our emotional roots begin to form. Every experience, good or bad, shapes our psyche and influences how we navigate the world. Experiences of emotional rejection or abusive environments leave invisible yet profound marks. Gabor Maté, in his study of trauma, asserts that these wounds don't simply fade. They transform into silent pains that follow us through life. Maté describes a concept called proximal separation to illustrate a subtle but devastating emotional wound. Imagine a child whose parents meet their physical needs but are emotionally absent. This disconnection, though hard to identify, creates an emotional gap the child struggles to fill alone. Later in life, this same search may manifest as addictive behaviors, not as self-destruction, but as an attempt to escape a void they cannot understand. And it's not just visible traumas. Even seemingly normal situations can shape this quest for relief. Someone turning to alcohol may be trying to silence echoes of deep-seated insecurities. Someone spending hours compulsively on social media may be seeking external validation to fill an internal sense of inadequacy. But the void isn't just an individual experience. It's magnified by a society that disconnects us from ourselves. We are bombarded with messages that tell us we're not enough, while consumerism promises happiness in fleeting things. Gabor Maté points out that this modern context creates the perfect storm for addiction. Even those with a healthy upbringing are not immune. The constant pursuit of approval, fueled by social media and a culture of comparison, makes emotional emptiness almost inevitable. The problem with the void isn't its existence, but how we interpret it. Too often, we see this internal space as something to be avoided at all costs. But both Jung and Maté challenge us to view it differently, not as a curse, but as a call. The void, they say, is an invitation to look inward, to confront the parts of ourselves we've ignored or repressed. It asks us to question, what is truly missing? Which parts of ourselves were left behind along the way? While we continue trying to fill this hole with addictive behaviors or temporary distractions, we forget to ask what it's trying to tell us. And what happens when this attempt to soothe the pain becomes the very source of our suffering? This is the crux. The void isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a symptom of something deeper. Something that needs to be understood, because as long as we ignore it, it will continue to shape our choices and often trap us in cycles of pain. And it's within this cycle that we begin to see how what once seemed like an escape becomes a prison. Imagine being stuck on a carousel that never stops spinning. At first, it might seem fun or bring a sense of relief, but soon everything changes. You start feeling dizzy, exhausted, unable to get off. This is the cycle of addiction. What begins as a refuge quickly becomes a trap that consumes life. It all starts with a trigger, a painful emotion, a memory, or even a constant state of anxiety and boredom. This trigger awakens an internal discomfort that demands immediate relief. At this moment, the person turns to the addictive behavior, a sip of alcohol, an impulsive purchase, or endless scrolling on social media. Initially, relief comes. For a moment, the world feels lighter, the pain dissipates, and a sense of control emerges. But this peace is an illusion. The addictive behavior doesn't solve the underlying problem. It only masks it. And when the effect fades, the pain returns, often stronger than before. This cycle is not just psychological, but also biological. The brain plays a crucial role, especially through the dopamine reward system. Gabor Maté explains that in the beginning, the addictive behavior triggers a surge of dopamine, creating a feeling of pleasure. However, as the brain adapts, it reduces its response, requiring greater effort to achieve the same effect. What once brought relief becomes a compulsion. Over time, the behavior is no longer a conscious choice, but something uncontrollable. Even knowing the consequences, damaged health, strained relationships, abandoned dreams, the person feels powerless to stop. The more they try to escape the pain, the deeper they sink into it. Carl Jung saw this cycle as an unconscious attempt to fill a psychic void. He believed addiction wasn't simply a habit or a moral failing, but a search for something missing. This search, though misdirected, reveals a longing for reconnection with oneself, with others, or even with a sense of purpose. Gabor Maté expands on this, arguing that all addiction is, at its core, a response to suffering. Whether it's childhood trauma, emotional disconnection, or a lack of meaning in life, addiction arises as an attempt to escape emotional pain. Yet, as Maté aptly states, false needs, no matter how often they are satisfied, can never truly fill the void. Take the example of a woman who found comfort in food after years of emotional abuse. Each meal seemed like an attempt to silence painful memories, but this search for relief ended up harming her health and self-esteem. Or the man who turned to alcohol to avoid loneliness, only to realize years later that this choice had isolated him even further. These stories, though unique, share a central truth. Addiction turns the search for relief into a source of continuous suffering. And here lies the most important point. The cycle of addiction can only be broken by recognizing that it is not the solution, but part of the problem. This moment of awareness is the first step toward escaping the carousel and seeking a path to healing. But how do we fill the void left by addiction? And how do we find something that truly satisfies without creating new prisons? These questions lead us to the next crucial point: the search for meaning and connection as paths to breaking the cycle. Because, as Jung said, you do not free yourself from something by avoiding it, but by facing it. Imagine looking into a mirror that not only reflects your image, but also reveals the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. This is the process of awareness described by Jung and Gabor Maté, a journey to face the shadows of the psyche and understand what lies behind addiction. For Jung, awareness is the first step toward transformation. He believed that as long as we fail to bring unconscious elements into consciousness, these hidden forces will continue to control our lives. In the context of addiction, this means identifying the emotional triggers and unresolved traumas that sustain the compulsive cycle. It's not just about stopping the behavior, it's about understanding what drives it. Gabor Maté adds that denying suffering is what keeps addiction alive. He explains that true recovery only begins when we allow ourselves to fully feel the pain we've been avoiding. This isn't easy. Emotional pain can be overwhelming, which is why many choose to escape it. But as Maté points out, the temporary relief offered by addiction is an illusion. The only way to break the cycle is to confront the pain head-on and uncover the lessons it holds. Awareness must be followed by integration, another core concept in Jung's psychology. Integration is the process of accepting and harmonizing all aspects of ourselves, including those we deem unacceptable. For instance, someone who suppresses their vulnerability to appear strong may discover that this repression is the root of their suffering. Integration involves embracing vulnerability, acknowledging it as valid, and learning to express it in healthy ways. Integration also requires redefining the void. The void doesn't need to be something to fear or fill at any cost. Instead, it can be seen as a space for growth and self-discovery. Jung believed that by confronting the void, we pave the way for individuation, the process of becoming our truest selves. This journey, while challenging, is profoundly transformative. Imagine someone struggling with substance or behavioral addiction. Instead of merely trying to stop the compulsive behavior, they decide to investigate its origins. Perhaps they uncover a deep loneliness or a sense of inadequacy rooted in childhood. By recognizing and accepting these truths, they begin to build a new relationship with themselves, one that no longer depends on escapes to cope with pain. But awareness and integration don't happen overnight. They require courage, patience, and often external support. Therapeutic approaches that explore the unconscious, such as Jungian analysis, can be invaluable tools in this journey. Practices like meditation, reflective journaling, or even honest conversations with trusted friends can also help. However, this internal transformation cannot occur in isolation. Overcoming addiction also involves reconnecting with the world around us. No matter how profound the inner work, we are social beings. Full healing depends on rebuilding the human connections that the cycle of addiction often fractures. This leads us to the next essential step in this journey: social reintegration and rediscovering purpose. After all, no healing is complete unless it translates into a new way of living. How can we transform the void into meaning and create a life that genuinely connects us with others? When we talk about overcoming addiction, the image that often comes to mind is one of willpower or isolation to avoid triggers. But research has shown that the path to healing is quite different. It flows through human connection. A groundbreaking experiment in the 1970s by psychologist Bruce Alexander challenged prevailing ideas about addiction. Earlier studies placed rats in isolated cages with access to two types of water, one pure and the other laced with morphine. Most rats became addicted to the drugged water, consuming it until they died. This seemed to confirm the idea that certain substances, like morphine, are irresistibly addictive. But Alexander questioned this conclusion. He proposed that the environment in which the rats lived influenced their behavior. To test his theory, he created Rat Park, a spacious, stimulating environment filled with toys, quality food, and most importantly, other rats for social interaction. The results were astonishing. The rats in Rat Park largely ignored the drugged water. Even those previously addicted chose the pure water when placed in this enriched environment. What does this teach us about addiction? Alexander demonstrated that addiction isn't solely about chemistry or willpower, but a response to the environment. In isolation and disconnection, addiction thrives. But in a context that fosters connection, purpose, and well-being, its grip weakens. This idea is echoed by Johann Hari, author of Chasing the Scream, who argues that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. Hari describes how addiction rates are significantly lower in communities where people have strong social support, meaningful family ties, and a sense of purpose. He also highlights that successful rehabilitation programs focus on rebuilding connections with others as a central aspect of recovery. Another compelling insight comes from studies on group therapy. Research shows that support networks, like those provided by Alcoholics Anonymous, have a profound impact on recovery, not just by helping maintain sobriety, but by fostering a sense of belonging. These networks don't just address the addictive behavior, they address the loneliness and emptiness that often fuel it. The common thread in these findings is a powerful message. Overcoming addiction isn't just about abandoning a substance or behavior. It's about rebuilding human connections, finding a sense of belonging, and most importantly, rediscovering purpose. Addiction teaches us something fundamental about the human condition. It's not merely a destructive behavior, but a reflection of our desperate attempts to cope with pain, loneliness, and disconnection. In every person trapped in this cycle, there's a story, not of weakness, but of struggle. A struggle against an inner void, against past wounds, and often against a world that disconnects us from ourselves. Carl Jung and Gabor Maté guide us on a path that goes beyond blame or quick fixes. They invite us to look inward, to confront the shadows and voids we've avoided. This journey is not easy. It requires courage to face what we've ignored, patience to rebuild what was lost, and above all, a desire to reconnect with ourselves, with others, and with life itself. Addiction, at its core, reminds us of what truly matters: meaning, connection, and purpose. It's not just about quitting a behavior, but about filling the space it once occupied with something genuine and meaningful. For those still on this journey, there is a message of hope. No matter how far you've fallen, there is always a way back. The road may be difficult, but it's possible. Because in the end, what we all seek is the same: to feel whole, to feel connected, and to find meaning. So, the question remains, what connections are we ready to rebuild? Because perhaps, in healing our relationships with others and ourselves, we'll discover that the void we feared isn't the end, but the beginning of something new. And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.